In Montana Territory, 1881, they said the only thing harsher than winter was the judgment of men. When Margaret Holloway stepped off the stagecoach in Whitetail Creek, whispers followed her like shadows. Too big, too much, a burden no man would bear. Look at her. She'll break any bed she lies on. How many cows did they slaughter to make that dress? No wonder she came west. Even the desperate men back east wouldn't have her. What they didn't expect was the one man who saw beyond their cruelty. A former slave who'd built his own empire in the shadow of hatred. A man who knew that true worth isn't measured by pounds of flesh, but by the weight of one's character. I see a woman with strength enough to survive out here, and that's more than I can say for half the men in this town. Stay until the end to witness how two outcasts, judged by their appearance rather than their hearts, found in each other what society denied them both: dignity, respect, and a love powerful enough to silence the cruelest voices in the Montana wilderness. Before we continue this powerful story, take a moment right now to subscribe to the Black Rancher channel and ring that notification bell. Why? Because we're uncovering the forgotten stories of black cowboys and ranchers who helped build the American West, stories deliberately erased from the history books you grew up reading. If you believe everyone deserves to see themselves reflected in America's great narrative, share this video now. These untold tales of courage, dignity, and triumph deserve to be heard. Subscribe now, and let's reclaim this buried legacy together. Now let's journey back to Montana Territory, 1881, as our story begins. Whitetail Creek, Montana Territory. April 1881. Margaret Holloway clutched her worn carpet bag as the stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the Whitetail Creek Hotel. At 34, she had endured more than most: a father who'd abandoned the family when she was 12, a mother who'd worked herself to death in a Chicago textile factory, and a lifetime of stares, whispers, and cruel remarks about her size. The journey west had been brutal. 3 weeks of hard travel, sleeping upright because the other passengers complained about her taking up too much space. 3 weeks of eating less than she needed because the stagecoach stops charged her double for meals. But Montana promised something Chicago couldn't: a chance to start fresh. Her cousin Mary had written about the teacher shortage in the territories, mentioning that Whitetail Creek School had been without an instructor for nearly 6 months. With her teaching certificate and 5 years of experience in Chicago's public schools, Margaret hoped her qualifications would matter more than her appearance. As she stepped down from the coach, her boots sinking into the spring mud, the familiar whispers began. Lord Almighty, did you see the size of her? Poor horses probably need a week's rest after hauling her across the territory. Margaret kept her eyes forward, her spine straight. She had expected this. It was the same in every town, every city. The weight of judgment was something she'd carried far longer than the extra pounds on her frame. The hotel owner, a thin man with suspicious eyes, looked her up and down before reluctantly sliding the registry book toward her. 1 room. For how long? A week, perhaps longer, Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. I've come about the teaching position. The man snorted. School board meets tomorrow. Don't unpack too much. As she signed the registry, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Through the dusty window, Margaret saw a group of men gathering around a tall, broad-shouldered black man who had just dismounted from a magnificent chestnut stallion. That's Isaiah Washington, the hotel owner muttered, more to himself than to Margaret. Owns the Double W Ranch outside town. Started with nothing after the war, now runs one of the biggest cattle operations in the territory. Margaret watched as Washington moved with quiet confidence through the crowd, nodding respectfully to some, ignoring others. Something about his dignity in the face of obvious tension resonated with her. Here was someone else who knew what it meant to be judged before speaking a single word. Came up the Texas Trail with nothing but 3 cows and an old mule, the hotel owner continued. Now he's got 5,000 acres and a herd that makes the white ranchers sick with envy. They hate him for it, but they need his cattle for the railroad contracts. When Isaiah Washington entered the hotel, the room fell silent. His eyes, dark and observant, swept the lobby before landing on Margaret. For a moment, they regarded each other, Two outsiders in a place where differences were rarely tolerated. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am." It was a simple courtesy, but in that moment, it felt like the first real welcome she'd received in Whitetail Creek. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a simple clapboard building with peeling white paint and windows that rattled in the prairie wind. Inside, Margaret faced the 5 members of the Whitetail Creek School Board, all men, all regarding her with thinly veiled disgust. "Your credentials are adequate, Miss Holloway," said Walter Prescott, the board chairman and owner of the town's mercantile, "but we have concerns about your suitability." Margaret had heard this before. In Chicago, the superintendent had used almost identical words before relegating her to the poorest school in the worst district, places where her appearance wouldn't disturb the more refined families. "My suitability, Mr. Prescott?" She kept her voice level, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. "This is frontier country, Miss Holloway. Our children need to learn from someone who exemplifies discipline, self-control." His eyes crawled over her figure. "We need someone who can keep up with energetic children, someone who won't tire easily." Beside him, Reverend Phillips nodded solemnly. "The teacher sets an example for impressionable young minds. Gluttony is one of the 7 deadly sins, Miss Holloway." The injustice of it burned in her chest. They knew nothing of her struggles, nothing of the childhood illness that had altered her metabolism, nothing of the years she'd starved herself trying to conform to society's expectations. "I assure you, gentlemen, my physical condition has never interfered with my teaching abilities," Margaret said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I have excellent references." "References from Chicago don't mean much out here," interrupted James Hargrove, the town banker. "This ain't some fancy eastern city. Our ways are different." "Different how, Mr. Hargrove?" came a deep voice from the doorway. Isaiah Washington stood there, his broad shoulders filling the frame. He stepped into the schoolhouse, removing his hat as a gesture of respect that seemed pointed given the circumstances. "This is a private meeting, Washington," Prescott said coldly. "School board meetings are public by territorial law," Washington replied calmly. "And as the largest taxpayer in this district, I believe I have a right to attend." The atmosphere shifted. Margaret could feel the hatred radiating from the board members, hatred mixed with something else. Fear, perhaps. Or respect they were loath to give. "I understand you gentlemen are looking for a teacher with credentials," Washington continued. "Miss Holloway has presented hers. I'm curious what credentials the board possesses to judge her teaching ability based on her appearance." Prescott's face reddened. "We don't need a man like you telling us how to run our school." "A man like me?" Washington's voice remained even. "A cattle rancher? A taxpayer? Or did you mean something else, mister?" "Prescott!" The tension in the room was palpable. Margaret watched in astonishment as this stranger defended her, not out of pity, but out of a fundamental sense of fairness. "The children need a proper role model," Reverend Phillips insisted. "Indeed they do," Washington agreed. "Someone who's educated, experienced, and brave enough to travel alone to a new territory to pursue her calling. Someone who faces adversity with dignity." He looked directly at Margaret. "That sounds like exactly the kind of character we should be teaching our children." For the first time since arriving in Whitetail Creek, Margaret felt something like hope. Not because Isaiah Washington had saved her, she had been fighting her own battles for years, but because in this hostile environment, she was not entirely alone. As the meeting continued, it became clear that while the board was reluctant, the town's desperate need for a teacher outweighed their prejudice. They offered her a 1-month trial, with the clear implication that they expected her to fail. Outside the schoolhouse, Margaret found Washington waiting beside his horse. "Mr. Washington, I want to thank you for speaking up in there." He nodded. "No thanks necessary, Miss Holloway. I believe in judging people by their character, not by appearances. Something this town could learn. You've made enemies on my behalf." A smile touched his lips. "I had those enemies long before you arrived, ma'am. Being the only black rancher in the county tends to put a target on your back." Margaret understood then why he had intervened. He knew what it was to be judged, to be found wanting before proving your worth. Well, I still appreciate it, though I suspect your intervention has only made them more determined to see me fail. Then don't fail, he said simply. Show them what you're made of. As he mounted his horse, he paused. There's a social at the church this Saturday. The whole town will be there. Might be a good chance for you to meet some of the parents and children before school starts. The thought of facing the entire town at once made Margaret's stomach clench. I'm not sure that's wise. First impressions have already been made, Washington finished for her. Now it's time to change them. As he rode away, Margaret watched his straight back, his confident posture. Here was a man who had built something from nothing, who faced contempt daily yet refused to be diminished by it. If he could do it, so could she. You're halfway through our story, but the most powerful moments are yet to come. If you're moved by this narrative of courage in the face of cruelty, hit that subscribe button now and join the Black Rancher community. Our stories celebrate the forgotten heroes of the American West, men and women who fought not just against nature, but against prejudice to create their own legacy. Don't miss a single episode. Subscribe now and ring that notification bell. Now, let's return to Whitetail Creek, where Margaret is about to face her greatest challenge yet. The church hall buzzed with conversation and laughter as Margaret stepped through the doorway. Immediately, the noise diminished, replaced by whispers and stares. She clutched her reticule tighter, fighting the urge to flee. This was nothing new. She had endured similar scrutiny at every social gathering she'd ever attended. Yet somehow, in this small frontier town where she knew almost no one, it felt sharper, more personal. She had taken extra care with her appearance, her best navy blue dress with its modest white collar, her hair neatly pinned, a touch of rose water behind her ears. Not that it would matter. People like her were never allowed to be just well-dressed or merely presentable. They were always too much or not enough. "Miss Holloway, you came." 10-year-old Sarah Jenkins broke away from a group of children and rushed toward her. Margaret had met Sarah briefly at the general store the day before, and the girl's open friendliness had been a welcome surprise. "Hello, Sarah. Yes, I thought I should meet some of my future pupils before classes begin on Monday." "Come meet my ma and pa," Sarah said, tugging at Margaret's hand. "And my brothers too. Tommy's only 6, but he already knows his letters." Margaret allowed herself to be led across the room, aware of the gazes following her. Sarah's parents were polite, if reserved, and Margaret found herself explaining her teaching philosophy and experience. "We're just glad to have a teacher at all," Mrs. Jenkins admitted. "The children have fallen behind without proper schooling." Encouraged by this pragmatic response, Margaret circulated through the room, introducing herself to other parents. Some were coldly civil, others openly hostile, but most seemed cautiously willing to give her a chance, if only out of necessity. The atmosphere shifted when Widow Carson, a thin, bitter-faced woman who ran the town's boarding house, raised her voice deliberately. "I simply don't understand how someone who clearly can't control her own appetites is supposed to control a classroom of rowdy children." The room fell silent. Margaret felt heat rise to her face, but years of similar humiliations had taught her to maintain her composure. She was about to excuse herself when another voice cut through the tension. "Perhaps, Mrs. Carson, character is better measured by the words that come out of one's mouth than by the size of one's waistline." Isaiah Washington stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that emphasized his powerful build. Beside him stood a young black boy of about 12, similarly well-dressed, and looking around the room with curious eyes. Washington moved through the crowd with the same quiet confidence Margaret had observed at their first meeting. When he reached her side, he bowed slightly. "Miss Holloway, I'm glad you decided to attend. May I introduce my son, Samuel?" The boy stepped forward, extending his hand with perfect manners. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am. Pa says you're going to be our new teacher." "Our new teacher?" Margaret asked, glancing at Washington. "Samuel will be attending your school," he confirmed, "if that's acceptable." The implication was clear. Not everyone in Whitetail Creek would welcome a black child in their classroom. "All children deserve an education, Mr. Washington," Margaret said firmly. "Samuel will be welcome in my classroom. The look of gratitude in Washington's eyes warmed something in Margaret that had been cold for a very long time. The rest of the evening unfolded in a blur of introductions and conversations. With Washington's tacit support, even the most reluctant parents were civil. Margaret noticed how he moved through the social hierarchy of the town, respected by some, merely tolerated by others, but ignored by none. Later, as Margaret helped serve refreshments, she overheard two women whispering, "Can you imagine them together? The size of her and the color of him? Disgusting. But maybe they deserve each other. The Negro and the fat woman, who else would have either of them?" Margaret's hand trembled, spilling punch onto the tablecloth. Before she could recover, Washington was beside her, offering his handkerchief. "Don't give them the satisfaction," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "Their words reflect their character, not yours." "I've heard worse," Margaret admitted, dabbing at the spill, "but it never gets easier." "No," he agreed, "it doesn't, but we go on anyway." There was something in his understanding that reached past her defenses, past the walls she had built over years of protecting herself from judgment and ridicule. This man saw her, really saw her, not as a curiosity or an object of disgust, but as a person worthy of basic human dignity. "Would you care to dance, Miss Holloway?" Washington asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. "Dance? I don't think that would be wise. People are already talking." "People will always talk," he said with a slight smile. "The question is whether we let them dictate how we live our lives." Before she could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. Walter Prescott had arrived, clearly intoxicated and looking for trouble. "Well, look at this," he slurred, pointing at Washington and Margaret. "The African and the elephant, right in our church." He laughed at his own crude joke. "Is this what our town's coming to?" Reverend Phillips stepped forward. "Walter, you're drunk. Go home before you say something you'll regret." "Regret? The only thing I regret is letting that," he gestured at Washington, "buy land in our county. And now he thinks his boy belongs in school with our children." Margaret saw Samuel shrink back against his father's side, his young face a mask of controlled hurt. She'd seen that expression too many times on too many children's faces, the look of someone learning too early how cruel the world could be. Something snapped inside her. Years of silently enduring insults, of turning the other cheek, of making herself small despite her size, all of it boiled over. "Mr. Prescott," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "As the new teacher in Whitetail Creek, I feel obligated to inform you that your behavior is providing a very poor example for the children present. If you cannot conduct yourself with basic civility, perhaps you should indeed go home and return when you're capable of acting like a gentleman." Prescott's face purpled with rage. "How dare you speak to me that way, you fat—" "That's enough." Washington's voice was quiet, but carried an unmistakable authority. "You're addressing a lady, Prescott. Apologize." "I don't take orders from—" "The lady deserves an apology," Washington repeated, stepping forward. "And so does my son." The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew Washington's reputation, a fair man but not one to be crossed. Even drunk, Prescott seemed to realize he had gone too far. "This ain't over, Washington," he muttered, before storming out. As the door slammed behind him, Margaret found herself trembling with a mixture of anger and residual fear. She had spent a lifetime avoiding confrontation, knowing that standing up for herself often made things worse. "Are you all right?" Washington asked gently. "I'm fine," she lied. "But your son—" "Samuel has heard worse," Washington said, with a sadness that broke Margaret's heart. "We both have." "It's not right," she whispered. "No," he agreed, "it's not right. But it's the world we live in. All we can do is face it with dignity and teach our children to do the same." He glanced around at the crowd, many of whom were pretending not to listen. "I think perhaps it's time for us to depart." As Washington collected Samuel and prepared to leave, Margaret felt a profound sense of connection to this man who understood what it meant to be an outsider. In a town full of people who saw her only as her size, he had seen her courage, her intelligence, her worth. "Mr. Washington," she called as he reached the door, "I still owe you a dance. A smile touched his lips. "Another time, Miss Holloway. I look forward to it." Margaret's first month as Whitetail Creek's teacher was a baptism by fire. With 32 students ranging from 6 to 16 years old, all at different levels of education, the challenges were enormous. Some of the older boys, clearly influenced by their parents' attitudes, tested her authority daily. James Prescott, Walter's 14-year-old son, was the worst offender. He made crude remarks just quiet enough that she couldn't quite hear them, encouraged younger children to misbehave, and openly refused to complete assignments. "My pa says you won't last the month," he said one afternoon after school, when she had kept him late to discuss his behavior. "He says nobody wants someone like you teaching their children." "And what do you think, James?" Margaret asked, refusing to be provoked. The question seemed to catch him off guard. I think you're too soft, too easy to ignore." "Am I?" She met his gaze steadily. "Then why are you still here after school instead of fishing at the creek with your friends?" For a brief moment, something like uncertainty crossed the boy's face before his sneer returned. "Won't matter soon anyway. They're holding a special school board meeting on Friday. Everybody knows they're going to let you go." Margaret had suspected as much. Despite her best efforts, despite the progress many students were making, she knew certain board members were determined to see her fail. "Until that happens, you'll complete your essay on the Louisiana Purchase," she said calmly. 5 pages, due tomorrow. You're dismissed." After James left, Margaret sank into her chair, the weight of constant judgment pressing down on her. She had hoped things would be different here, that her teaching ability would eventually outweigh prejudice. But some hatreds ran too deep. Samuel Washington, in contrast, had become one of her brightest pupils. Despite being the only black child in the school and facing daily harassment from boys like James, he maintained a quiet dignity that reminded Margaret powerfully of his father. She had seen Isaiah Washington only briefly since the church social, a respectful nod when their paths crossed in town, a brief inquiry about Samuel's progress when he came to collect his son one afternoon. Yet his presence lingered in her thoughts more than she cared to admit. On Thursday afternoon, as Margaret was preparing to lock up the schoolhouse, she looked up to find Washington standing in the doorway. "Mr. Washington." What a surprise. "Miss Holloway." He removed his hat, revealing a face lined with concern. "I heard about the school board meeting tomorrow. Samuel told me." Margaret sighed. News travels fast in small towns, especially when Walter Prescott is determined to make trouble. Washington stepped into the classroom, looking around at the educational charts Margaret had posted, the neat rows of desks, the shelves of books she had ordered at her own expense. "You've done well here." Not well enough, apparently. "Prescott has been rallying support against you, and against Samuel's attendance." Margaret felt a surge of indignation. "He has no right. Every child deserves an education." "I agree." "Which is why I'll be attending that meeting." Washington's expression was resolute. "I've requested to speak. Mr. Washington, I appreciate your support, but your involvement might make things worse. Some of the board members already resent your influence in town. They resent that a black man has succeeded despite their best efforts to prevent it," he corrected gently. "Just as they resent that a woman they've deemed unacceptable might prove herself capable." The truth of his words hung between them. They were both fighting the same battle, just on different fronts. "What will you say to them?" Margaret asked finally. "The truth. That you're the finest teacher this town has seen. That the children are learning more in 1 month with you than they did in the entire previous year. They won't believe you." "Some won't," he acknowledged, "but not everyone in Whitetail Creek shares Prescott's prejudices. Many parents have noticed the improvement in their children's education. They just need someone to speak up first." Margaret wished she could share his optimism. In her experience, people rarely stood against the tide of public opinion, especially when doing so meant aligning themselves with outcasts. "There's something else you should know," Washington said, his voice growing serious. "Prescott has been suggesting that there's an improper relationship between us." Margaret felt heat rush to her face. "That's ridiculous. We've barely spoken since the social." "People like Prescott don't need facts. They feed on suspicion and fear. Washington's expression was grim. I'm sorry to have brought this trouble to your door. You didn't, Margaret said firmly. Walter Prescott would have found some reason to object to me, even if you'd never spoken up at that first meeting. Washington studied her face for a moment. You're a remarkable woman, Miss Holloway. Most people in your position would be packing their trunks by now. I've been run out of better places than Whitetail Creek, she said with a wry smile, but I'm tired of running. Something shifted in Washington's expression, a softening, an admiration that made Margaret's pulse quicken. Then we'll stand our ground together, he said quietly. Whatever happens tomorrow. As he turned to leave, Margaret called after him. Mr. Washington, why are you doing this? Supporting me could cost you business, even make things difficult for Samuel. He paused in the doorway, his profile silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. Because it's right, and because when I look at you, I don't see what they see. I see strength, courage, intelligence. He turned to face her fully. I see a woman who's more than enough. The words, so simple yet so profound, brought tears to Margaret's eyes. How long had she waited to hear that? To be seen as more than her size, as sufficient as worthy. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded once, then was gone, leaving Margaret to wonder at the unexpected alliance that had formed between them, and at the unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest at the memory of his words. The schoolhouse was packed for the special board meeting. Margaret sat ramrod straight in a chair facing the board members, aware of the whispers and stares behind her. News of Walter Prescott's accusations had spread through town like wildfire, adding salacious speculation to the already volatile mix of prejudice. Prescott himself sat among the board members, a smug smile playing at his lips. Beside him, Reverend Phillips looked uncomfortable, while James Hargrove studied some papers before him with feigned interest. The other two board members, Dr. Miller and Mr. Peterson, the blacksmith, were harder to read. This special meeting of the Whitetail Creek School Board is now in session, announced Prescott, clearly enjoying his role as chairman. We're here to evaluate the performance of Miss Margaret Holloway during her probationary period as teacher. From her seat, Margaret could see Samuel Washington sitting with several other students near the back of the room. There was no sign of his father. Before we begin, I must address certain concerns that have been raised about Miss Holloway's moral character, Prescott continued. It has come to the board's attention that Miss Holloway may be engaged in an improper relationship with... The schoolhouse door swung open and Isaiah Washington entered, followed by at least a dozen parents, mothers and fathers Margaret recognized as belonging to her best students. Mr. Prescott, Washington said, his voice carrying easily over the murmurs that had erupted at his entrance. I believe I requested time to speak at this meeting, as did several other parents. Prescott's face darkened. You're out of order, Washington. We haven't reached that portion of the agenda yet. Then perhaps we should, said Dr. Miller unexpectedly. If so many parents have taken time away from their work to attend, we ought to hear what they have to say. Prescott looked as if he might object, but a glance around the room seemed to convince him that proceeding with his accusations in front of so many witnesses might not serve his purpose. Very well, he said tightly. Washington, you have 5 minutes. Isaiah Washington moved to the front of the room with the same quiet confidence Margaret had come to admire. He turned to face the crowd rather than the board. Many of you have known me for years, he began. You know I'm not a man who involves himself in town matters unless necessary. I tend my ranch, raise my son, and mind my business. But today, I can't remain silent. He gestured toward Margaret. Since Miss Holloway arrived in Whitetail Creek, our children have received the education they deserve. My son Samuel has learned more in 1 month under her guidance than in an entire year with the previous teacher. Several parents nodded in agreement. Yet some in this town seem determined to drive her away, not because of any failing as a teacher, but because she doesn't fit their narrow idea of what a teacher should look like. Prescott shifted uncomfortably. This isn't about her appearance. Isn't it? Washington turned to face him directly. Then what is it about, Mr. Prescott? Her teaching methods, her dedication, her knowledge. He looked back at the assembled parents. Or is it about the fact that she treats every child with respect and dignity, including those others might consider unworthy? Margaret watched in amazement as several parents stood to speak after Washington. Mrs. Jenkins praised Margaret's patience with her struggling son. Mr. Abernathy, a gruff rancher, admitted his daughter had never shown interest in books until Miss Holloway introduced her to poetry. Even the station master, a notoriously taciturn man, spoke up about his son's improved arithmetic skills. As the testimonials continued, Margaret noticed a shift in the room. The hostility that had greeted her arrival was being replaced by something else. Not universal acceptance, certainly, but a grudging recognition of her worth as a teacher. When the parents had finished, Prescott looked considerably less confident. These endorsements are all very well, but the board must also consider Miss Holloway's moral example. If you're referring to the rumors you yourself have been spreading, Walter, said Dr. Miller with unexpected sharpness, perhaps you should state them directly so Miss Holloway can respond. Put on the spot, Prescott's bluster faltered. Well, it's inappropriate for an unmarried woman to be consorting with me? Washington finished for him. A black man? The blunt statement of what had only been implied sent a ripple through the crowd. Miss Holloway and I have had exactly 3 conversations since she arrived in Whitetail Creek, Washington continued calmly. Hardly what anyone would call consorting, but even if we had been, that would be our business, not yours. Now see here, Prescott began. No, you see here. Washington's voice remained level, but there was steel behind it now. For years I've watched this town judge people not by their character or their actions, but by superficial things they cannot change. I've endured it because this is my home, and I won't be driven from land I rightfully own and have worked with my own hands. He moved to stand beside Margaret's chair, a gesture of solidarity that brought tears to her eyes. Miss Holloway has endured the same judgment, the whispers, the stares, the cruel remarks. Yet she comes to this schoolhouse every day and teaches our children not just reading and arithmetic, but kindness and respect. His hand came to rest gently on Margaret's shoulder. So I ask you, which is the better moral example? A woman who faces cruelty with dignity and does her job despite it, or those who would punish her for things that have nothing to do with her character or her abilities? The room fell silent. Margaret could feel the weight of dozens of gazes, some sympathetic, some conflicted, some still hostile. But something had changed. Washington's words had forced people to confront their own prejudices, to see them laid bare. I move we extend Miss Holloway's contract for the remainder of the school year, said Dr. Miller suddenly, with a full evaluation to be conducted in June based solely on her teaching performance. I second, said Mr. Peterson, the blacksmith, speaking for the first time. Prescott looked from one to the other in disbelief. We can't possibly... All in favor? Dr. Miller interrupted. His hand went up, followed by Peterson's. After a moment of hesitation, Reverend Phillips raised his hand as well, avoiding Prescott's outraged glare. Motion carries, announced Dr. Miller. Miss Holloway will continue as teacher of Whitetail Creek School. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that. Prescott storming out, parents coming forward to congratulate Margaret, children cheering. Through it all, Isaiah Washington remained beside her, a steady presence amidst the tumult. When the crowd finally began to disperse, Margaret found herself alone with Washington in the schoolhouse, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Thank you, she said softly. I don't know what to say beyond that. You don't need to say anything. You earned this victory yourself. No, Margaret shook her head. Without your support, they would have dismissed me regardless of my teaching ability. Washington's expression grew thoughtful. Perhaps. Or perhaps you underestimate the impact you've had on this town in just 1 month. The impact we've had, Margaret corrected. Together. Something shifted in his gaze, a warmth, an intensity that made her heart beat faster. Miss Holloway, Margaret, he said, his voice lower now. There's something I need to tell you. Something I've wanted to say since that first day at the school board meeting. Yes, she whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "When I look at you, I don't see what they see," he said, echoing his words from the day before. "I see a woman of extraordinary courage and kindness, a woman who has faced the worst of humanity, yet still believes in teaching children to be better." He took her hand gently in his. "In a world that has told both of us we're not enough, not the right color, not the right size, I see someone who is more than enough, who has always been enough." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. How long had she waited to hear those words, to be seen, truly seen for who she was rather than how she looked? "Isaiah," she said softly, his first name feeling right on her lips. "They'll never accept us. You know that." "I'm not asking them to accept us," he replied, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "I'm asking if you would consider accepting me." The question hung between them, fragile and momentous. Margaret thought of the life she had lived, the loneliness, the judgment, the belief that love was something meant for other women, thinner women, women who fit society's narrow definition of beauty. And then she thought of this man before her, who had built a life and a legacy in defiance of a world that tried to deny him both, who saw in her what no one else had ever bothered to look for. "I accepted you the moment you defended me at that first meeting," she admitted. "I just never dreamed you might accept me in return." His smile then was like the sunrise, slow, gradual, but with the promise of warmth to come. "Then perhaps we both need to dream bigger." As he leaned forward to kiss her, Margaret closed her eyes, surrendering to the impossible, beautiful truth that sometimes, against all odds, two people judged as not enough by the world could find in each other exactly what they needed. And in that moment, it was more than enough. It was everything. It was... If this story touched your heart, remember that countless similar stories remain untold. Of black cowboys and ranchers who helped build the American West, of women who defied society's expectations to forge their own paths, of love that flourished despite seemingly insurmountable barriers. Subscribe to the Black Rancher channel right now to ensure you never miss these powerful narratives that history tried to erase. Hit that notification bell and share this video with someone who needs to hear that they too are enough, exactly as they are. Thank you for joining us on this journey through America's forgotten past. Until next time, remember, our history is richer, more diverse and more beautiful than we've been taught, and it belongs to all of us.